I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar, A Talk with Teachers, with Dr. Jeff Duncan-Andrade, sponsored by the UCI Teacher Academy, with support from the Schools First Federal Credit Union. This talk will be recorded today, and it will be available on the UCI Teacher Academy website. And I want to introduce myself. My name is Elizabeth Van Ness. I am the Faculty Director of the UCI Teacher Academy. And before we get started, I want to share a little bit about the Teacher Academy and our goals at UCI in developing this academy. So the Teacher Academy intends to support teacher educators, classroom teachers, teacher leaders, and administrators in their instructional improvement efforts. A guiding framework for the Academy is that we see people who work in these settings as having expertise that can be shared to improve teaching and ultimately student learning. For us, the Teacher Academy is about bringing teachers and school leaders together to collaborate, inspire, and lead one another through transforming educational opportunities that become more student-centered, socially just, and humane. Today, I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Jeff Duncan-Andrade. I can think of few people who can talk about what it means to put school reform and school improvement efforts into the hands of those who are on the ground doing the hard work of teaching and learning and improving education for our youth. I was first introduced to Dr. Andrade's work when I attended the Carnegie Foundation's Improvement Summit several years ago, where he was one of the keynote speakers. His work challenged us to ask ourselves, how can we provide opportunities for youth from under-resourced communities to experience academic success, while at the same time creating context for youth to exercise their agency, to tackle some of the most persistent systemic educational problems that serve to minoritize youth and thus ultimately position them as agents of change. Dr. Duncan-Andrade's accomplishments are many. Most notably is his engagement with communities and his social imagination that led to his founding of the Roses in Concrete Community School, the Teacher Excellence Network, and Community Responsive Education. What I find most promising and inspiring about his work is his commitment to working in and alongside communities to build capacity to transform the educational experiences of youth. So I want to thank you, Jeff, for joining us today. Before we get started, I want to just share with folks how we're going to organize today's session. Our conversation will be moderated by the director of the Teacher Academy, Nicole Gilbertson, and a graduate student in the UCI School of Education, Jonathan Montoya, both of whom bring expertise in working in communities and schools to support professional learning to improve student learning and agency. The format for today's talk will be a conversation with Dr. Duncan-Andrade. We invited participants to submit questions, and we also generated questions through reviewing his work. These will form the basis for the first 30 minutes or so of our time together. During the conversation, you may have questions or comments, and you may submit these in the chat, and our colleague, Dr. Doran Zinger, will monitor this space and bring these to the conversation during the second half of our time together. We will also invite participants to raise questions in the last 15 minutes or so using the Q&A feature of Zoom. I'd like to now turn it over to Nicole to get us started.
Great, thank you, Beth. I also want to thank everyone for attending today. I know it's probably been a really long day of Zooms, and I see some names, familiar names in our chat, and it's good to know that we're all in the space together. And I'm so very honored to be able to have this conversation with Jeff Duncan-Andrade and my colleagues. So let's get started. We want to start with the historical look at your work, Jeff. Your essay, Hope When Required When Growing Roses in Concrete, came to us shortly after Barack Obama was newly elected. Your article drew on a vision of hope and proposed what you call critical hope in response to different versions of hope that serve to repress communities. Can you briefly summarize your vision of critical hope for our community?
So first of all, I just want to say thank you for inviting me and for sharing some space tonight to everybody, thanks to everybody for being here on Zoom at 4 o'clock. And before I, get into a response to that question, I feel like it is our tradition, but also my responsibility to just acknowledge the land that we're on. And so I just want to acknowledge that I'm on Ohlone land, and encourage you all to give daily acknowledgement to the indigenous people whose land you're living on, and whose land that you're trying to do sacred work on. And I think that I guess that one of the kind of divisors between what I talk about in that article, between what I describe as critical hope and what I describe as false hope, is just an acknowledgement of why we are where we are, right? And a commitment to truth telling. And so I think when you do that, you're fairly quickly able to sort out the difference between what is largely happening in schools, which is often institutional work. And I hold up institutional work in a binary. It's a bit of a false binary because there's all kinds of space in between, right? But for the purposes of our discussion, right, we have some binaries here to work with, right? There's critical hope and there's false hope, and there's institutional work and there's sacred work. And I think critical hope is the sort of natural byproduct of sacred work. And false hope is the natural byproduct of institutional work. And you can't cross that bridge between doing institutional work and sacred work without getting permission. And so I think that that's one of the first mistakes that we make and continue to make in this work, is that we're trying to do good work without acknowledging that that the very essence of the structures that we are trying to operate inside of are by their very definition and design toxic. And I think that there's a kind of almost innocence, right? False innocence that that adults take, that acts as though somehow schools are an ultimate good. And that we've all sort of agreed that this is good for children. Well, I don't. And I think there's certainly lots of evidence to suggest both that schools are not benign operators in children's lives, and that in the lives of children, particularly the most vulnerable and wounded ones, schools have been consistently toxic. Like if you sort of examined the overall experience of a vulnerable child from 8 to 3, how many of those hours do you think actually, where they actually feel like they're getting medicine, where they actually feel like they're being treated like they're sacred and valued? And the research is really clear around this. And if you're a teacher, you know it too, right? There's usually one space, maybe 2 spaces, where those children really feel held and seen. And then the rest of their day, they're in survival mode. Like they're ducking, dodging, right? All of this toxicity, all of these threats to their well-being. And then we wonder why, right, those kids push back or resist or disappear on us. That's an adult issue, right? And if we can kind of reorient ourselves, re-examine the purpose of public schools, and as long as we are acting as if we don't need a serious, hardcore discussion around that question, for what? Why are we taking children from their families at age 6 for 13 consecutive years for 8 hours a day? Why are we doing that? And if your answer to that question is, anything to do with so they can have a better life, so that they can go to college, so that they can compete in a global economy. If you like, go ahead and just, take all that bucket and let me just vomit on it, because there is no evidence at all that is what is happening in the aggregate for the most vulnerable and wounded children in our society, cross-cutting. Like, we're not even talking about race yet. Like, go to the Appalachians where it's multi-generational entrenched white poverty, same thing. Okay, so we've got a crisis of purpose on our hands in schools. And if schools are to become sacred spaces where sacred work is done, well, you can't do sacred work on somebody else's land without permission. So we have to ask permission first from the people whose land we stole to do sacred work on their land. And that's a whole process that doesn't sanctify the school at all, right? But that begins a different journey, a different way of thinking about, right? What is it that we are doing? Why are we doing it? And who needs to give us permission and who can't give us permission? So I never felt like my principal or my superintendent was my boss. I never felt like my principal or my superintendent could give me permission to do the work that my ancestors called me to do. I was not accountable to them, and that cost me. So I know I'm talking to teachers, right? And I just want to be 100% clear, right? That there's a cost for that for us. But how are we going to ask young people to activate their critical agency? How are we going to ask young people to create a fundamental shift in our society if the adults that are leading in their education are too cowardly to do it themselves? Right? They're looking to us. And if they see us being compliant, if they see us hiding behind our social justice rhetoric in the moments where it's most important for us to truth tell, then they know the deal, right? Like, if I'm really going to be a truth teller, if I'm really going to be somebody who wants to transform the society, then school's not for me, because that's not what's supported here. That's not what's encouraged here. And I don't need to look at the rhetoric. I don't need to look at what goes up on the bulletin board. All I need to do is look at how the adults act. But if, as adults, right, we begin to acknowledge that the purpose and project of public education is youth wellness, that's the purpose. And in order for young people to be well, everything else has to get cleared off the plate. And we have to rebuild the foundation of the project. And if youth wellness is the foundation, okay, then that's what does school have to look like? To be pouring medicine, right, sacred value, self-esteem, self-love, truth into the lives of the most vulnerable and wounded young people in the nation. Because if we get it right with them, and I'll just say it, like it's Black youth and Indigenous youth. Like, if we get it right with Black and Indigenous youth, all the other kids are going to be all right. But that's the group we think about, act about, move about last, right? That they're always the, how do we fix that piece? You don't. You don't. You don't build hope in the group of young people who you are shoving into an institution that by its very design was meant to undermine their hope. The Zoom environment is in some ways, it's so interesting that I'm in all these conversations about how I feel about Zoom learning. And what's really interesting and what I think is going to be very telling, and in my own experience, in my own children's classes, right? So my sons go to Roses and Concrete, they're in 2nd grade. So I get to see a lot more. I mean, I've been a teacher in this community for almost 30 years, right? So I've seen a lot. I've been in a lot of homes, but I'm in the homes of young people in my community every single day now because of Zoom. And it's really interesting to me, the conversation about, oh my gosh, like what's going to happen to the most vulnerable ones? Like they're falling further and further behind. And there's some truth to that. There's probably some truth to that, but falling further and further behind in what? Like in a race that they were already designed to fall further and further behind it, as if, right, they were going to catch up if we didn't have Zoom, okay? As if the pandemic didn't happen, suddenly like, well, this would be the generation of Black and Native and poor kids that outperformed middle-class wealthy white kids. Don't think so. But what is interesting is that now those kids don't have to go into toxic schools every day. So some of the kids who were doing the worst in school are actually happy now. Today is the anniversary of my father's killing. And so I was driving my sons somewhere this morning, and they called my mom. My mom's 91. And my mom said, do you miss school? And my son, whose name is Tayari, said, yes and no. And my mom said, well, what do you mean? Now, mind you, Tayari is 7 in 2nd grade, okay? And he goes to Roses and Concrete, okay? So Roses and Concrete, far from perfect, but it's about as close as I've seen as an effort to actually try to do some of these things that I've experienced in my career, okay? So he says, well, I don't miss having to be in class. And my mom is like, but you still have Zoom classes, right? And he's like, yeah, but they're at home. And she's like, well, what's the difference? And he's like, I don't have to stay in class. I don't have to stay and listen to them. I can get up and move. I can go somewhere if I don't feel like listening. But in school, they make me stay. I have to stay. And I was just sitting there listening like, wow, like maybe it's a good idea if we ask kids, and then my mom says, well, what do you miss? And of course, y'all know what they miss, right? They miss their friends, right? They miss the social interaction, the very thing that we punish them for. Right? The very thing that is evidence that they're not listening, they're not paying attention. So the very thing that young people are most drawn to school around, we minimize it. And the older they get, the less they're allowed to do it. The more secretive they have to be. The more they have to like slide. Y'all remember writing each other notes, right? And it was like wrong. It was just wrong. It was wrong to communicate to your homies because what the teacher was saying was more important. So I think there's a lot of lessons here for us, right? When you take this idea of hope, right? Which is a strategy. There is good medical evidence around it. Like it is really important, right? But to me, it's less about what it means. Because I don't, to be honest, like I don't really know anymore. I feel like hope is I don't know, it's like a shifting playing field depending on like, are we talking about hope during a double global pandemic? Or are we talking about hope, in like middle-class America? Like, so I think hope is a really important idea to explore and understand more deeply, but it's context specific, right? And it's different for every child. And the truth of the matter is that we have some of the pieces in the teacher conversation, right? We've talked about differentiated instruction, but to me, like that's how you like uncover what hope is. That there's going to be some cross-cutting elements with different children, but there's also going to be some things that are very unique to a particular child based on the material conditions of their life and based on the history of the community where you're doing the work. And if you don't unpack those things, right, then hope will just become another version of some random false metric that is somehow evidence of us that we care about children, that all of our actions suggest that we really don't. It doesn't make us bad people, okay? That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that it's high time as a field and as a nation that we revisit the foundational question about why we are doing this. And no time better than right now. The gloves are kind of off, right? Like nobody knows what this is going to look like in the comeback. And so I really hope that teachers and educators and school leaders and communities do not look for school to reset itself around a set of agreements and practices that have never, ever worked in the aggregate, I would argue, for any of our young people, but certainly not for the ones that need us the most. I mean, where are the school shootings happening? These are middle class and wealthy kids showing up in, like, you know, distinguished schools with rifles and grenades and shooting their classmates, and all the evidence is everybody knew that this kid was hurting like that, right? And yet the apparatus of school couldn't stop. It couldn't stop itself and say, it's all of us or none of us. And until this child is well, none of us are well. And that was the message that those children were sending. It's all of us or none of us, and you don't see me. And I've been showing you, and I've been showing you, and I've been showing you, and you're going to see me. Problem is, we saw him too late. And that lesson has recurred so many times in so many different ways, and I'm guilty, right? This is not an external indictment, right? This is me looking in the mirror after nearly 30 years and talking to a bunch of people who are on this same journey with me and saying, we're doing this wrong, not kind of wrong, all wrong. And this is a moment right now where we are allowed, perhaps more than ever in our lifetimes, to ask that question. And I think that is what will make young people hopeful. That adults come back and they say, you know what, we were wrong, and we're not doing it that way anymore. And that's basically what I heard from my son today.
That was fantastic. Thank you for that. So I think a lot of the questions that we got from the participants kind of center around the idea that you just explained, and what they can do to disrupt that. Like, as a practitioner, what can you do? And your book, the Art of Critical Pedagogy, kind of lays out a lot of, you know, practical things that educators can do to help disrupt those systems. So can you kind of share in a little bit more detail, and you touched on it already, your vision for the role of educators and teachers in disrupting those oppressive structures?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've always believed that you don't need to ask for or wait for permission, because if you do, your career will be over before it's granted. And you know, I go back to some of the stuff I said at the very beginning of that first answer, which is to say that there's, you know, that great love. I can't remember who it was, you know, Paulo Freire or Dalai Lama or Antonio Darder, or all three of them told me in different ways and different times that, you know, great love requires great risk. And so you gotta hold both of those realities, that you've got to be willing to take risks, and you've got to be humble in your love. You've got to be humble in your risk taking. You've got to know that you might take a risk, right, that actually makes things worse. And that's okay. That's okay, as long as you're humble around that and you can receive that feedback, and that you don't get, you know, all caught up in your feels. Like, but I was trying to, it doesn't matter what you were trying to do. Intent does not matter. Impact matters. And if you care about your impact, right, then you will change your intent. But the only way that you're going to do that is if you don't get hung up in your intent, that you're paying attention to your impact and not your evaluation of your impact, but the evaluation of your impact by the people who you were intending to impact, right? And so, you know, the teachers in my son's school think Tayari likes class. They really do. Like, he does very well, or else he, gets put in his little hole in the bed. No, I'm just kidding. He's my son. Like, of course he's gonna like be ready to roll, right? But he also tells the truth. And I don't think his teachers have ever really heard him say that, right? They've seen him show it, but they've never actually, right? Because he's doing well by all of those metrics, right? Then they haven't really taken the time to explore with him whether or not they're having the impact on his life that they want to have. And I think that's a lack of humility, right? And there's a lot of other stuff too. I think that his teachers are actually quite humble. But I think that if you're going to be an agent of change inside of an institution that is hell bent on not seeing change, then you're going to have to be prepared to get blowback, to take risks, and to be a perpetual learner. And the other piece I would add is that I think what has kept me in this for so long is you have to have community. The very nature of this beast is to isolate the teacher, right? And it's the oldest strategy of war, divide and conquer. So, I've been so lucky to have amazing peers, colleagues, and mentors. And so I'm surrounded by a group of people who don't let me not be humble, first of all, right? But secondly, who are great sounding boards because I don't have it all figured out. And I mostly just have questions, and may not feel that way when you hear me talking, as a, invited, speaker. But most of my day is just spent in my own head asking questions that I don't have answers for yet. And then exploring those questions with young people, exploring those questions with my community, exploring those questions with my colleagues and my peers, and then going at it again and again and again. And I think that if you go on that journey and you understand that the meaning is in the mess, and I think that we spend an inordinate amount of our time in classrooms and in schools trying to sanitize the project. And somehow we feel like that if everybody was in their seats and compliant and quiet, that we were successful. And if everybody is in their seats and compliant and quiet, we get President Donald Trump. So we're responsible for that. Like, not schools alone, right? But like we created the conditions, right, that have allowed these conditions. And we keep pointing the finger at them, whoever them is, when it's like, nah, actually, right? Where did all those people that didn't engage socially, politically, economically, what was the one institution all of them passed through? School. That's the common denominator, right? So I think that part of the what begins to shift that is when teachers begin to shift that, and they begin to shift in their own head. What would it actually look like if my classroom was really popping? Like, if I walked out of my class, at the end of a day and was like, that was the shit, like that, like, pop your collar and go have a drink. Like, what does that look like? And if what that looks like is quote unquote full engagement, right? Like proper participation, everybody brought their materials, then you want to sanitize the project, and you are missing out on the meaning. Because the meaning is in the mess. The meaning is in the kid who you didn't see because you just wanted to see evidence that you were doing your job correctly. And I knew, hard as it was, that I was getting some things right, okay, when kids were pushing back on me. When kids were asking the question that, if you have young kids, you know this question and you hate it. And it is, why? Because that question is always relevant. think about, like, just come up with any statement in your head right now, any statement, absolutely factually true, like water is wet, and then say, why? And it makes total sense. And then you can actually answer the why, and then they can ask why again, and it makes total sense again, right? This is why they killed Socrates, literally, right? They killed Socrates, right? Because he would not stop asking why. Socrates was on the stand, right? He's in front of his jurors, and they ask him, they say, we will pardon you if you will just stop asking why. And Socrates responds, right? And in a normal environment, I'd say, what do you think he said? And then everybody would say, well, why? Is it no? And that would be hella funny if he did, but he did not, right? What he said was, I would sooner die than stop asking why, because it is the essence of the human experience. And so they killed him, because why is an incredibly dangerous question, right? But we get asked that all the time as parents. We get asked that all the time as teachers. Why do we have to do this? And I think we ought, like, we have a, like, you have the response. I mean, I don't know about your moms, but my mom had a locked in response for that. And it was because I said so. And that's not good enough. That's not good enough. When young people ask us, why do we have to do this? Because I said so is about control. Because I said so is about, I don't want to deal with the messiness of an actual intellectual inquiry into my practice. And if we can start there, create the conditions for young people to ask why. Now, I'll add to this, and then I'll move on to the next question, but I'll add to this caveat, because I've seen people try to do this, particularly like around critical pedagogy, where they don't want to be an oppressor. So they stop being the instructional leader. And kids hate that. They don't want you to show up and be like, well, I don't know. What do you guys want to do? What? Like, you're the teacher, right? So I'm not saying to not come with a plan, right? I'm saying that the best classrooms I've ever been in, they set up guardrails, okay? And then they give young people lots of room to maneuver. And they're willing to engage in any sort of meaningful inquiry about where they place the guardrails. And if you can keep to that consistently, building structures in your practice that allow you to get consistent feedback from young people and from families, then you can move on that journey, and schools won't do it for you. Okay, so I said I'd stop there, but I'm gonna give you actually something practical you can do. Okay, this is what I used to do. At the end of every unit, so I was a literature teacher for many, many years. And at the end of every unit, usually 6 to 8 week units, what I would do is I would randomly select kids from my class roll, okay, usually like 5 to 7. And then I would buy them lunch. And we would come into my room at lunch, and we would all sit in a circle, and I would set up a video camera, and we would break bread together, and I would ask them 3 questions. And then we would just I would not talk. They would just talk, and I would just listen, and I would take notes, and I would record it. And I asked them, if you could change anything about the unit, what would you change and why? Okay. And then I asked them, if you could keep anything in the unit, what would you keep and why? Okay. And then the third question was, if you could change anything about this class or this school, what would you change and why? And it was the best PD I ever had. Year over year, session over session, it was the best PD I ever had. And there's 2 strands to ways that you can use this. The reason you're taking notes is because some of the stuff they say you can change tomorrow. Some of the stuff you can change after lunch, right? And some of the stuff is kind of headier, it's heavier, it's bigger, and that's why I videotaped it. So every summer, what I would do when I was getting ready to come back to school is I would go back and watch all the videotapes of my students. And I would let their inputs really began to shift the ways in which I was structuring the units, the class, right? All of it. And word got around that he'll listen to you if you tell him the truth. And that's really important, because if you ask for feedback and you don't use it, they will stop giving you feedback.
Really appreciate that. And I was kind of processing a few of the things that you said. So in terms of being able to kind of pivot with student feedback, and then the idea of maintaining power and control of a classroom. So I was thinking, like you shared, something really deep today. You said, your father was killed. It's the anniversary. So if a student came to us with that, do we just chug along with the lesson that we had planned for the day, right? Like, so thinking of pandemic level suffering on a daily basis, how would you, as an instructor, pivot if you had a lesson planned and then someone shows up with that? What do you do?
So first I'd see it at the door, right? Like I'm doing a wellness assessment before they get in my room. And if you're tuned in, you'll see it most of the time, right? There's some kids who mask it better than others, but if you're sort of seen as that teacher, then kids are going to show it to you. They might be masking it all the way on their walk to their class, and then they go and put the face on when they come through the door, because they know you watch, they know you listen, and they know you'll do something about it. Okay, so with the fairly large percentage of young people who I had that kind of relationship with, right, I'm looking for it, and so we start class, right, and I'm locked in on them, and then I get proximity to them, physical proximity, right, and I get skin to skin contact. I touch their hand, I touch their shoulder, right, whatever the relationship is with them. Okay, and then I either slip them a note, because you ain't supposed to slip people notes, right? So it's a disruption. Like we're not doing school right now, right? Or I just, kneel down next to them and I just do a wellness check. You all right? And I look them in the eyes, right? And I know, yeah, I'm good. Okay, no, you ain't. Now, lunch, or later? Now. Cool. I always have we're always doing project work in my class, so it's never dependent upon me. I just got to get them started, right? And then I can do all kinds of one-on-one. If you design your lessons such that they are dependent upon you, you can't do wellness work. You need compliance, right? But if your students can run their own classes, then you can pull out, right? And so then I would pull out for a wellness check. And that wellness check would take as long as it took, because the period's only 50 minutes, 60 minutes, or if you have like a really advanced cutting edge school, you have a block schedule, which means you get 90 minutes, right? So, but it may not be enough. And I just ignore that bell. I got written up so many times for sending kids late to next period, right? And when the next group of kids comes in, they already know the deal. They already know the deal, because first of all, most of them are from the same neighborhoods anyway, so they already know that their dad got killed, their brother got killed. They already know, right? And so they just come in, and all I got to do is say, do your thing, okay? Right? Can you build towards autonomy, self-determining education in your class so that you can do the work that you really need to do? Okay. Now, in the event that they say lunch or later, that's locked in. You can't forget. You can't forget. You have to, where are you going to be at lunch? You want to meet me back here? You want to go out? Where you want, right? After school, same thing. Okay. I'm coming to your house. If you don't make it through the day, I'm going to find you. because that's our commitment to each other. Okay. So, but also understand that it's not about a one-off, right? You're letting them know I'm on a journey with you. And I want you to know I see you, right? And you got to check in, you got to follow up, you got to pay attention to the signs, because trauma, I think one of the things that we've learned about trauma in the past 10 to 15 years that we didn't really understand when I first started teaching, but I think I understood it intuitively, is that trauma, okay, is not an event. Trauma is an experience, which means it's always with you. And I think people think about trauma, particularly people who haven't been through trauma, right? Is that they think like it's like this moment that happens, and then you get over it, right? And the more distant you get from it, the easier it gets. Time heals all wounds. Okay. Well, whoever said that ain't never really been wounded, because time can bring wounds back. Time can take you, right, into perpetual woundedness if we don't pay attention to wellness and healing and medicine. In the event that I miss with the kid, right, I didn't read the signs, and it comes up, okay, either concretely in the way, right, that I brought it up, okay, or in a more concrete way, which is like they start blowing up the classroom, right? They get in a fight, they curse somebody out, they walk out, they lay their head down and go to sleep, whatever, right? They come in smelling like weed, they come in drunk, whatever, right? Like there's lots of signs that you don't got to be a rocket scientist to read. But if that comes up, okay, then it's very much the same approach, but oftentimes I try to get them out of the space, because the space is triggering them. Their peers are triggering them. They don't want anybody to know, but they want you to know that they know you know, right? And school doesn't allow that space. They don't want to talk to the counselor. They don't want to go to the wellness center, because if they wanted to talk to the counselor or go to the wellness center, they wouldn't have come to your fucking class. They would have gone to they want you, right? They want you. So don't send them to the counselor or the wellness center. You're the counselor or wellness center. Now you could supplement with the counselor wellness center, particularly if you feel like this is like outside my pay grade. Like I don't know how to deal with this. But you have to ask children, can I take you there? And make sure you're taking them to medicine, because all counselors don't hand out medicine. Some counselors hand out cancer, right? All wellness centers don't create more wellness. And so don't presume that the title is equivalent to the impact. And so you have to ask, and you have to vet it yourself. Know your kids and know which counselors work best with which kids. Know your community. A lot of times the best counselors aren't on the school campus, right? But you can still get kids to those therapists and counselors. So I had a massive Excel spreadsheet that just listed off, right, names and resources of people that I had personally vetted in my community. I mean, now that spreadsheet is massive, right? And pretty much anything that a young person brings to me, I can get them to a quality resource that I know won't cost them or their family any money. It took me years to build that, right? And years of vetting and years of checking with kids, right? After they came back, how was that? Would you go again? Would you recommend it to a friend, right? And if it was like, nope, that's crossed off. Like that's all the evidence I need, right? So I think that you have to take a tactic that acknowledges that every child is a little bit different. And the only way to know what they're asking for and what they need is to ask, what are you asking? What do you need? Right? And then you start moving from there. And that's what I mean by the meaning is in the mess. If you have a checkbox, well, if this shows up, then I do this, and then I do this, and then I do this, right? It'll work with some kids. It will. But it will not work with a bunch of other kids. And if your goal, right, is to make your space a space of wellness for as many kids as possible, then you have to start with inquiry. You have to start with wondering. Okay? And one of the best ways this has been explained to me is from this really amazing child psychologist who works a lot with young people in trauma. He worked with Nadine Burke for many years. If you don't know Nadine Burke, she's our Surgeon General for California, first Black woman to be Surgeon General. She wrote the book, The Deepest Well. She has some pretty good stuff around child trauma. But anyway, this doctor's name is Jason Thompson. And Jason said to me once, he said that, one of the mistakes that teachers make is that when young people show up wounded, when they bring their trauma, the teachers think they have to fix it. And he said that sometimes you can, but a lot of times you can't. And they're not actually hoping that you will. He said, oftentimes, what young people who are experiencing ongoing exposure to toxic stress and trauma, what they actually want is an empathic witness in hell. And sometimes that's all I did as a teacher, is I just bore witness, right? And I just listened. And I said, I see you. And I said, it's not your fault. And I said, I love you. And I said, I'm going to be here no matter what. For your whole life, I will be here. If you need anything from me, I will always, always do anything I can to show up. And if I don't have answers, I'll try to find people that do. That's my only promise to you, right? I can't promise I can fix it. I can't promise I can make it stop. But I can promise to bear witness to the fact that you're in hell right now.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go to some Q&As directly from the participants. So one of the participants asked, how can teachers navigate the lines of advocacy and still keep their jobs?
I think we covered that one.
Yeah, just do it.
Once you start doing that math, you're done. You a sucker. Like you because when it's not hard until it gets hard. It's not hard until it gets hard. But there's going to come a moment, if you're really advocating for young people, there's going to come a moment where you have to stand up against the institution. Okay. And I think that I have a lot of criticisms of the ways in which teacher unions have operated, a lot. And I'm somebody who's been union since I was 20, okay? And still am. But that is one place where I think that we got union right, is that if you act the fool, which I did, okay? So when I started teaching when I was 20, okay? So I couldn't even go home and drink it off, right? It was like, I had all of the good stuff of being 20, 21, 22, right? And all the bad stuff, which was I thought I knew it all. And I thought, that it was the system and not me, and, all of that kind of self-righteousness. And so I did some dumb shit where I didn't respect the fact that, that everybody's showing up every day, right? Wanting to be better. And they're just not. And I got really judgy around that. And I see a lot of that in young teachers. I see a lot of self-righteousness. And it's a slippery slope, right? Because I think there's a way in which we need people to hold the system accountable. But I think the ways in which I did it, I think I needed to get checked. And so, but I think the wrong people were checking me. So when I really got checked, because the way that the system will check you is through power, right? And I didn't need power to check me. I needed mentorship. I needed my principal to see this dude will die for this project. Like, this dude he'll give everything to this. Why are you writing that teacher up? That's just stupid. Like, pull them to the side, mentor them. Don't try to break them. Don't try to conform them. Develop them, support them, be a fucking leader, right? And that's the difference, right? Between a leader and a despot, right? Leaders are humble. Leaders see the potential in people, right? They see the glass half full and they fill it up. Despots need control because they know they're not doing their job. And when they get called out on it, they get threatened, right? So I had a lot of despot-like, right, school leaders. But I also had some amazing veterans around me. And there's one person who I'm going to call into the space. His name is Brother Herman Brown. And I've been teaching 30 years, okay, almost 30. It's my 29th year. So when I started, Brother Brown was a vet and he's still teaching. He still teaches math in West Oakland, okay? So that's how OG this dude is, right? He's OG with 2 O's, okay? And one day, this is like my second year or something, and you know, of course, I'm like beloved by the students because I'm the 21-year-old who can go out and like whoop everybody's ass in basketball. This is middle school, okay? So like really not that great of an accomplishment, but I could. And right, and you know, we listen to hip hop in my class and you know, all of that nonsense, right? So I was cool for probably a lot of the wrong reasons. But anyway, Herman, right, pulls me aside, and Herman is, before he was doing Black and brown boys groups before there was any of this conversation about Black and brown boy groups. Okay, so he's like an originator, and he pulls me to the side and he says, "You don't really love these kids." And I was like, "What?" I was like, "Brother Brown, you know I love these kids." He's like, "No, you don't." And I was like, "What do you mean?" He said, "You love being a certain image with these kids. But if you really love these kids, you would love their colleagues." And I was like, "Oh." And he's like, "You have answers to questions they haven't been able to unlock for years. And you withhold them from them because you are so consumed and arrogant with what you're doing. And that's how I know you don't really love these kids. Because if you really love these kids, you would understand that when they leave your class after first period and they go to second period, there's somebody next door to you that if you gave them some answers, those children would actually have a better experience in second period. And if you really loved them, you would care about what was happening in second period. And if you really cared about what was happening in second period, you would care about the teacher in second period. Dope PD. And so I say to teachers all the time now that good teachers, I was good, right? I wasn't in my second year. Nobody's good in their second year, okay? Let me just disabuse all of you young teachers out there right now. Like if you're in your first couple years, you suck, okay? Just, it's okay. Like you just do, because that's just facts, okay? Thank you, Mandy, facts, okay? But so, and that's because you gotta respect this craft. This is a time-honored craft. Okay? It takes years of banging on your craft to really figure out how to create the classrooms we're talking about here. I'm 29 years in and I still don't get it right. Okay, so honor and respect the challenge and character and commitment it takes to be a member of this craft. But hey, what you can bring every day, because you still haven't figured out multi-tiered assessment, you still haven't really figured out how to teach kids how to read, you still haven't really figured out how to respond to multiple forms of trauma, you still haven't really figured out how to create a dynamic and learning environment. You haven't, okay? So that's the technical aspects of the craft that you got to bang on, okay? And you got to keep getting more tools in your toolbox. Until you have those tools in your toolbox, you are screwing kids over. You're shorting them. And so you have to overcompensate on the skills that your ancestors gave you. You can love on kids, right? You can show up for kids. You can be an empathic witness in hell. You don't need PD for that. Okay? And so you overcompensate with the gifts that the Creator gave you, the gifts that put you on this sacred path and this sacred journey to serve young people, okay? And you keep banging on your craft. And as those skills come up, okay, the mistake that I see people make is they start backing down on the other stuff, right? And they start relying too heavily on the technical aspects that they think they've figured out. But if you can maintain that same commitment, that same drive to being who you were when you were 20, 21, 22, 23, coming into this, can you remember why you became a teacher? And if you can stay connected to that part of your soul, then you can become a master at your craft. But I think that there's some people, right, who do that and they just do it in their own space. Okay. And I think those teachers are good. But I think to go from good to great, I think the difference between a good teacher and a great teacher is that a good teacher shows up every day and they kick ass in their classroom. But great teachers show up every day, kick ass in their classroom, and they change school culture. And that's what Herman Brown taught me, that I am responsible, right, for all the souls in the building in the same way that every soul in the building is responsible for me. That's the difference between a school, an institution, right, and sacred community. And so I think that if you're going to, push around, right, these things, there's going to be pushback. And if you can humbly receive that, right, put your ego to the side and do it in a way that is respectful. I'm not using the word professional, okay? I'm using the word respectful. Can you see yourself in everybody else in that building, including your principal, including the people who are pushing back on the things that you believe in to your core? Okay, if you can do that, if you can practice what we call inlaquesh, right? What the Spaniards interpreted it to be, tú eres mi otro yo, you are my other me, right? If you can see yourself in, not just in the young people, right, but in other folks, right, then I think you can resist more effectively. And when the line gets drawn, stand where your ancestors would stand and accept the consequences. Because what's the alternative? And I think people lose track of this. They lose track of the fact that at any given point in your career, you can be put at a crossroads around a decision that you have to make as a teacher to support or not support a student or a family. And that decision is not about your job. That decision is about your pedagogy. Because if you bail, if you cower, if you pull back on all the bullshit ass rhetoric about social justice and Che Guevara and resistance and social change and Paulo Freire and all this stuff, and then in the moment of truth, you're like, but I don't want to lose my job. That is the lesson that your students will remember the most about you. That this whole social justice stuff, it's bullshit. Because at the moment when the people with the least amount of power needed an advocate to stand in front of power and say, nope, not this one, not this time, you turned your back. And you had a reason for it. You could explain it away, right? But there's no way that you can explain that away to your ancestors. And so if you aren't sure about who to talk to, I'll give you one ancestor that you can talk to that has helped me. Her name's Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was 4'11". She was paralyzed in half her body because she was beaten as a child with a metal rod by European slaveholders. And she could not read. She was illiterate. And Harriet Tubman, as I'm sure everybody on this Zoom knows, right, built the Underground Railroad. And there was a moment that one of my colleagues, who was the founding principal at Roses, told me about. She read this biography of Harriet Tubman, and this story has never left me. She was talking about how, Harriet Tubman escapes enslavement and then goes back. So she literally escaped the single worst possible human conditions one can endure and then goes back. And when they asked her, why would you go back? She said, because I can't be free if anybody else is not. And so she's going back. She's making a trip back, and she boards this train. And she sits down in the car and she looks across, and it's the slave tracker sitting directly across from her on the cart, or on the train car. And so she turns and she grabs a newspaper and holds it up. Harriet Tubman couldn't read. So what's that mean? She doesn't know if it's right side up or upside down. Imagine what that's like. And then when you're in that position where you don't want to lose your job, step out of the room, go to the bathroom, and have a conversation with Harriet Tubman and ask her what she thinks about your fear. And you draw from the ancestors, right? That's what Nadine Burke calls the deepest well. And if you don't dip into the deepest well, then you can't prepare young people to find their deepest wells. That's the most important part of your pedagogy, is what my colleague Antoia Combe calls SJMs, the social justice moment. Okay? At that crossroads, who will you be? Prepare yourself now and know who you need to talk to in that moment, and learn your lessons.
Jeff, it is just after 5 o'clock, and I'm not sure if you're watching the chat, but you have launched us into a very profound conversation that has been long overdue, I think, in this community. And I am with my colleagues and folks who are with us to say thank you for all of your profound thoughts today. I am hopeful that we can bring you back. I think people in the chat would love for you to come back in some capacity, and I hope that we can do that. We have much to learn. I know that I can say that as someone trying to lead this work at UCI, and I am grateful for Nicole Montoya and Doran for being here, for all of the folks who came tonight. It is not often that I am without words, and I'm just deep in thought right now. And I thank you for putting us in that space. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my honor. Please take care of yourselves, all of you. Be safe, be well. Can't let them win, y'all.
Thank you. Have a good night. Thank you.
You as well.